We'll be starting back in about 2 minutes. 2 minutes. We want to look at some things, what everybody needs to know about grief. And we'll discuss those just a few moments for our time together. Look at the first one there on the handout. Grief is a natural and healthy consequence that should occur when a loss has happened in your life. Unfortunately, there are folks in the world today says that they think that grief is unnatural and that it's unhealthy. Now, why would some people surmise that grief is unnatural and unhealthy? What are they thinking when they come up with that kind of idea, that kind of statement?
For some people, it is unhealthy because they grieve themselves to death.
Okay, some individuals do. Unfortunately, I like to use the phrase "wallow in their grief," to the point that it destroys the rest of their life if they allow it to do so. But generally speaking, other folks say that it's unhealthy or unnatural for you to grieve. Why?
It's painful.
It's painful. And we like to avoid pain if we can. 2011 November, this knee was done. June of 2012, this knee was done. Knee replacements. I'm the oldest, and I went first, so Don could follow later on, and he did the next year. But if you have knee replacement surgery, you better do the rehab, or else it's just all in vain. The rehab hurts. It hurts worse than I think I've ever hurt before. And I kidded the therapist that I just knew that her tag outside in the parking lot said, "Pain is me," because she gave me a lot of pain. But you have to work through that pain in order to be able to get better. The same is true in regard to grief. There's a persona out there today that if you're really in sync with your mind and your body and your life, that nothing will affect you. I don't know if you use this word in Missouri, but down in Alabama we would say bosh. Nope, that's not true. It's going to affect us. It has to affect us in regard to the relationships that we have in life, because after all, that's what relationships are all about in the first place. So grief is something natural, and it is something healthy that happens. Secondly, it affects us with our whole being. Emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, psychologically. Emotionally, how does it affect us? We cry. Or we may not cry at all. And there's a myth there that the people that are crying, the folks who are really grieving, the folks who aren't crying, they're not grieving. That's not true. That's not true. It's just a different way of grieving. So we got to remember that. A lot of times men will hold it tight and they'll hold it up because they've got to be strong for everyone in the family in regard to the grief situation. But believe you me, they are grieving. But it affects us emotionally. There's all kinds of the ball of grief that Don mentioned. It has all kinds of different feelings of emotion that we deal with. Physically speaking, how does grief affect us? All we can do is sleep, or anything, or it's just the opposite. We don't want to sleep at all. We find satisfaction in food. We want to eat all the time, or just the opposite. We don't want to eat anything at all. We just don't feel good. We just hurt. We just can't. Someone mentioned the idea of a fog. We just feel like we're in a fog all the time, physically speaking. Well, that's parts of grief. Mentally, we don't think so well. We can't persevere. We can't think about what comes next sometimes. Again, going back to that fog idea. We can't figure out where we need to be or what we need to do. When you're dealing with grief, particularly a close relationship loss, then it's going to affect you more so mentally in regard to all the decisions, all the things that you have to think about. And that's where we start panicking sometimes because we start forgetting to pay the power bill. Or we can't remember so-and-so's name when we see them in the grocery store. And so here's what we do. We don't usually identify that with grief. We start identifying that with Alzheimer's and dementia. Oh no, I'm losing my mind. We're just going through grief. But that's what sometimes people feel. And then spiritually speaking, how can grief affect a person spiritually speaking? We want to question why. We want to know why this happened or why it had to happen now. We want to get mad or ask questions to fill in the blank. Whether it's God, whether is that person, whether it's the minister, whether it's the elders of the church, whether it's the doctors that you think botched the surgery or the chemo that didn't work or whatever. All kinds of questions about why. And that has an effect on our spirituality. Again, I mentioned, the whole idea is a lot of times the things that we say and do sort of does this. We want to connect people back to God and back to where they need to be, but you've got to be careful what you say and how you say it. Okay, look at the third one. It's always an individual matter. Don's already mentioned that, so we won't go over that, but it's always an individual matter, regardless, even in the family. Even in your family unit, if you were all dealing with the same grief situation, you're going to handle that from your perspective. They're going to handle it from their perspective. And just understand that. It's a multifaceted emotion. There's no stage by stage. If you've ever come to Huntsville, Alabama, you know that is the headquarters for Marshall Space Flight Center, which is where they built the rocket, the Saturn V rocket, for man going to the moon in 1969. And there is an actual 363-foot mock-up of that 5-stage rocket, and you can just count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There it is. And they've actually now turned a building into one of the 3 actual engines and modules that were made for that, and it's turned sideways so you can see it inside a huge building. We invite you to come, and when you do, you better worship at the Lincoln Church of Christ. We'd love to have you. So, but the point of the matter is, that's a stage situation. Grief doesn't work that way, in our opinion. It works in phases. We phase in, phase out. We change from time to time. We feel different ways. And so, therefore, we don't get caught up in particularly Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross' 5-stage model that she did many years ago in her book. It can be the result of many kinds of losses. We've just talked about that. You know, we do need to remember this, The hardest grief in all the world is one in which the grief, loss has not died. Let me say that in a different way. When you're dealing with a loss that has no closure here in your life, in the world, then that's a tough grief loss to deal with. The person in incarceration in prison, a divorce situation where there's still people out there that are going out and living a life wrong, different ways, making mockery of who you are and what you're all about. A situation of something that deals with a relationship that can't be dealt with and can't be handled. That's a grief loss that continues. And the longer it continues, the greater frustrated fatigue you likely will get. Number 6, a person's feeling of grief will be directly affected by the significance of that loss. The intensity and duration of that loss, of that grief, will be proportionate to the depth of that loss. Let me put that in layman terms. The closer you are to a relationship, the greater the potential the loss will be. Okay, what are the, in relationships of life, what are the greatest relationships we have? Mom and dad, husband, wife, son or daughter, brother or sister. And I realize that there are other relationships. But if you deal with one of those losses that I've just mentioned, the greater the potential will be because of what? The greater relationship you had with them. Think about that. So when you're dealing with someone who's dealing with one of those losses, you need to sort of red flag in your brain, oh, they're dealing with one of those losses. I need to be kinder. I need to be more patient. I need to be more understanding. If you've got a little pencil or a pen next to that point, write a mathematical equation. It's very, very simple. Love, L-O-V-E, plus loss equals grief. Love plus loss equals grief. The love you had and continue to have for that situation, the love, the affection, the time, all the things that you put into that relationship, all of that love, plus the loss you've sustained or that you're going to sustain when that happens in your life will equal the reason why you grieve. That makes sense? Think about that. Why? You know, it's like this. Tomorrow, if you mention in your announcement somewhere someone that is dealing with surgery because their cancer has come back, Don and I will listen and be very sorrowful for you as a church family as well as that for that individual, because that's what we're supposed to do in the Lord's family. We're supposed to hurt together. But we don't have a relationship with that person. You do. But if we got a call this afternoon that someone that we both know and love in our family or in our church family died, which one are we going to be affected by the most? The relationship and the person that we knew the most. That's what. And so therefore, when we understand what grief is, why we wonder why we're hurting so much, the reason is look at the relationship. Look at the loss that's going to come from that relationship. Look at the love that we had for that individual or that situation. I mean, the man the big old cowboy that told me, it just killed me. That was his phrase. It killed me to have to put my horse down. He was not just looking at a horse. What was he looking at? 25 years of love and adoration for what that horse had provided for him and for his family all those years and all the different relationships he enjoyed. That's why it was killing him, because of the relationships. So love plus loss equals grief. Number 7, once a person has dealt with some loss in their life, they'll not be the same person that once before. They need to know that their change has brought that on. When grief occurs of any kind, we will not be the same again. You know why? Because we dealt with a loss. We dealt with a relationship. That's no longer what we would like for it to be, what we wish it could be, what we hoped it could be. It's gone. It's not there anymore. And therefore, it's going to affect us. Now, it's either going to affect us for worse or bad, or for good or better. That's where we come in. That's where you and I come in. That's what we're here for today in regard to this workshop today and tomorrow, trying to give you some understanding of why you feel what you feel so you can be better about it in regard to dealing with your losses of life. Henry Nguyen used the phrase wounded healers. We are all wounded healers in that we are wounded with a grief loss. But hopefully once we heal from that, once we get better from that, we can go out and make a mark on society and the Lord's church and helping people. So when someone says, you don't seem to be the same person anymore, think about it. Let them think about what you've dealt with, what you've gone through, what you're still going through. And that's why you've changed. But hopefully you can, and Don will talk about this the last session, what you can do to get better. And then the last one there is there's no real set time limits in regard to a person's grief process. We don't ever get over grief. Had a lady come into one of the classes. I was talking to a lady that dealt with grief education in regard to funerals here, and thank her for her wonderful work in doing that for, was it 17, 18 years? Wonderful work, because so many people do not get that information in regard to why they're feeling what they're feeling after a loss situation. But it was one of those funeral home situations. I was at a local place, and this lady came in and said, I don't know what you're going to talk about today, but said, my kids are giving me grief. That was her phrase. They're giving me grief over me hurting over my ex's death. I had never met her before in my life, and I thought, what? She said, so what do I tell them? So I just started asking questions. I said, ma'am, how long I was married to him 42 years. Said he cheated on me several times. I finally got rid of him, and he was with several different women, and he died at one of their houses. I mean, and I was thinking, whoa, I didn't know want to know all these details. And she said, but I'm hurting, and said, my kids are giving me grief because I'm hurting over his death. What do I tell them? I said, during those 42 years, ma'am, I said, did you ever have any good days? Well, sure I had good days with him. He was a good provider for my family, for our kids. Said he gave me 3 beautiful daughters that I wouldn't take anything for in the entire world. Said, yes, he was a good man in that regard. But tell me, what am I going to tell my kids? I looked her in the face, I looked her in the eyes, and I said, ma'am, you tell your kids to come back and see you in 42 years and you'll be okay. She said, what? I said, you're grieving over the loss of 42 years of life with that man, good and bad, right or wrong. Tell them to give you some time. Oh, I can't wait to see them. You see, that's what grief is all about. That's why there's no set time limits. We will likely grieve as long as we have a brain and a memory of a grief loss, and that's okay. Now, there are red flags of things that we need to avoid that we can't do. But the point of the matter is, that's what life's all about, relationships. So let's talk about, very quickly, what do we do and why is it that we have such difficulty in knowing what to say and how to say it in regard to the idea of grief? Let me ask this question. I think I know the answer. Aside from the lady that did grief training in funeral homes, aftercare programs, is there anyone else that has ever had any educational help in knowing what grief's all about? Raise your hands. We got one other guy who's been with Dean Miller, a great guy, a good friend of ours who does great work with widows and widowers, and he's done some work besides the lady that I've already mentioned. Why do we not know what to say to people when dealing with grief? We've not been educated. That's why. Who wants to come? Who wants to come to a grief education so you can be told what to say and what not to say to people that I don't want to come to that. Why would I want to do that? And so here's what we do. We say things we hear other people say without even thinking about it. And so therefore, that's one of the reasons why it's so difficult is because we copycat others without ever really thinking whether that situation fits us and the situation that we're involved in and whether it even makes sense in the first place. Also, people are afraid when it comes to grief, or when it comes to talking to others about grief, that they're afraid that they will hurt you by saying something about your grief loss. Don's already mentioned it. One of the things that we're afraid of is that people will forget us and our loss that we're dealing with. And most people will tell you, when you come up to me and you say something about let's just say, you come up to me and say something to me about my husband from a lady's perspective and how much you loved him and how much you miss him. You have blessed them tremendously by reminding them, yes, he was a wonderful guy, and secondly, you've not forgotten about him. People are afraid to say something because they're afraid they'll say the wrong thing. Through the past 25 years of doing this, I have made a list. I believe your list goes from 1 to 42. I have a longer list than that. These are actual statements made to people that I know through the years. Let's just talk about them, or talk about a few of them. Someone just call out a number, and we'll talk about it, okay? That's probably the easiest thing. We can't do all 42 of them, obviously, for our time's sake. 3. It must have been God's will. Thank you, ma'am. It is easy in situations of life, particularly that we cannot understand, that we cannot put a perspective as to why that happened and why it happened then and why it happened to that person, that we sometimes use, I don't know whether we do it as a cop-out or whether we just try to give them support and try to give them assurance that everything is going to be okay by saying, it must have been God's will. Isaiah 55, verse 8 and verse 9 tells us that God's ways are greater than our ways and his thoughts are greater than our thoughts. And I think that was Isaiah's way of saying, God is God and we're not. I don't think I know enough to be able to understand the will of God about why things happen. Unfortunately, sometimes, biblically speaking, bad things happen to good people because good people happen to be at the wrong place at the right time. Remember, I think it's Luke chapter, that's not 15, I think it's Luke 13 when they talk about a Tower of Siloam falling on people, and then there was another time when Pilate took people, Jews that had come into the temple, and he decided to kill them. And the question was, why did this happen, Lord? And it's interesting the way the Lord answered that question. I tell you, nay, except you repent, you also likewise perish. The point that he made was, and I think without saying it is, they just happened to be at the right place at the wrong time for something bad to happen to them. And tragically, that happens every single day in our world. And it hurts. And it takes our breath away. And it causes us to rethink and look at our faith, but we need to know that God is always there, just where God was when his son died on the cross for our sins. I just am afraid, personally speaking, to be able to say that that was God's will, because I don't think I know enough to be able to say. In fact, I'd like to think just the opposite. That was not God's will. Was 9/11 God's will? I don't think so. Bad people did bad things to good, innocent people, in the sense of them being in towers that were ran into by planes that destroyed their lives. And that was not God's will. I know we got the blame, but it was Satan's fault and his followers' fault, not God's fault in that regard. Another one. 20? Yes. Don will say more about this tomorrow afternoon. When we say, call me if you need me, if you need anything, call me. What is wrong with that statement is we have put the responsibility on the wrong person. Instead, we put the responsibility on the person that is grieving to be able to think about what they may need that they can't even think about at that point in time because of their grief. So you put the responsibility on the wrong person. Instead, you should say something like, in a few days, I'm going to call you, and I want you to think of something that I can do for you. And if not, then I won't come up with my own list. But I will be there for you. What does that say to them? I care. I love you. I want to do something for you. Or send them an email and say, here's a list, 5 things. Pick what you need this week. And I'll do it. You see the point? And I know we mean well. But unfortunately, folks, it's almost like in our brain we say, well, as long as once I've asked how they're doing and they say I'm fine, and then I say, well, you call me if I need me, I can do this, what? Check off. I can check you off my list because I've done my duty. No, you have not. Don't put the burden on them. You put it on self where it belongs, and then go find something you can do. And Don's going to give you a whole list of practical things to do tomorrow that both the congregation as well as individuals can do to help someone in grief loss. Another one. 9. Number 9. You're so lucky to have other children. As if to think and say and minimize the loss that just took place. Anybody that deals with stillbirth, anybody that deals with miscarriage, they go through those situations before, not just that as well. You know, it's almost like the assumption, well, you didn't want that situation, so just be grateful you can have other children. Number one, you've made an assumption that may not be true. They may not be able to have other children. And secondly, and more importantly, what have you said about that? That child was loved too. Don't minimize. Doesn't matter the size of the casket from that to a 95-year-old, the love is still there. The adoration is still there. The desire for that child to be able to grow up and be all that you would and God would want it to be, not there. Don't assume by saying something like that you've helped them. You've done just the opposite. Another one. 30. Right. Was he saved? Said to a mother, a parent whose son had been killed in an accident. That's what you call grief loss on top of grief loss. They're grieving over the death of a situation that they may not yet be able to understand and know all the details to, but then you've cut them to the core by, as it were, driving in the knife and turning it by saying, oh, tell me about their salvation situation. Avoid things like that. And if you know more, if you know the answer to that question based upon your knowledge of that individual, then you know, I mean, there's no invitation song after death. So you've just, it's a moot point. It's a situation that you have just hurt them more. So don't do that. Avoid that if you possibly can do so. And talk about, because again, that's on their brain, that's on their mind, and that may be one of the grief issues you will have to face and deal with later on, but deal with it later on, not at that point in time. Thank you for mentioning that one. Another one.
You can actually put number 18 in that same category.
Yeah, number 18. You do know, yes. That was actually said to a lady who was of the Catholic faith, and of course the Catholics have a teaching on that. But that was the whole point, is, again, aside from rightness and wrongness of that situation, but that's where that happened. And the lady, they talked about the lady just feeling so much in despair because she got reminded again, based upon their beliefs and their faith, what that meant for her son. And again, it just produced even greater grief. And again, so that's, but the point is, we just need to avoid, that situation. What else? 37. 37.
And I think you could add on there when people say you're so strong.
Oh, yes, and I think that's actually, number 5 says that as well. 37, oh, you look like you're doing so well, or you're so strong, or you're handling this so well. And the person typically that's grieving is thinking, if you only knew. If you really saw me as I really am. If you saw the facade that I am right now. You look like you're handling this so well. And a lot of times that is said to someone that you may have, if it's a grief loss that's involved parents, one of them may be really feeling the grief loss and crying and uncontrollable and emotional and whatever, and the other one, man or woman, is stoic and they're strong and they're trying to handle it and try to be there for them and everything. And the idea is, you look like you're handling that so well. You're doing the right thing. You're playing the right role for your family. Don't assume that. You don't know what they're going through. And you don't know what they're feeling, and you don't know what they're like when they get home at night, or when they get off in a closet somewhere, or when they get out in the woods somewhere. So just avoid how well they look at that point in time, because they're really not well. Yes, sir?
If you got to say something, tell them you love them and hug them.
There you go. Which is what we're going to talk about here in just a minute.
Sorry.
But you're exactly right. If you got to make an appearance comment, just say, okay, what do we do when we go to the hospitals? How are you doing today? Well, I'm laid out here, and they got IVs in every kind of place, and I've got on something that I don't want, that shows everything I shouldn't. Well, how do you think I'm doing? Why not say something like this? It's good to see you today. I'm sorry you have to be here. Stop. Don't say another word. You've opened the door for those who want to say something. And if not, you've not said, well, tell me about your medical condition right now. One more, and then we'll go to the other side and then take a quick break before we close out. Another one.
Do you remember the story on number
26. Oh, yes. Montgomery, Alabama, at university, the university there in Montgomery, and we were in a setting of professionals and others listening to a national live panel discussion of dealing with grief. And these panels, these very famous, well-known panelists had done this national live. This was years ago, before we have Zoom and other things like that. And so they were live all in a room together, and they were talking about different grief issues and they were pretty academic in regard to the things that they were saying. Very professional, but it was well done. And then they took questions. And this person called in and said, I wish we would do a better job in educating people in business how to react to people that are dealing with grief. And the panelist said, I totally agree. Do you have an example? And then she said, just the other day, she said, my child was killed in a car accident, and just the other day, an insurance person called me and said, ma'am, you're going to have to convince me that your child was worth $50,000. All of these panelists, these professional panelists in this room, all of them gasp, along with all of us in the audience, because we could not believe that someone had said that. And then this lady, the panelist, got a hold of herself and said, ma'am, we all are tremendously sorry for your loss. And I totally agree. That should never have happened. But unfortunately, those things happened. It happened in our society today, in our world today, because people are so out of sync with common decency and love and affection and kindness to other people. So what do we do say? Instead of saying, as you have there, you can't be angry with God, just make a comment. You know, God understands where I'm at. Look at Job. He let Job vent, and then there was a time when he told Job to hush and listen to him, because there were some things that Job didn't know. Instead of putting, you must put this behind you live, just feel what you feel right now. Just feel what you feel. Give them permission to grieve. I know exactly how you feel, just the opposite. I cannot even imagine what you're going through. And just stop right there. And if they want to make a comment to you, they will make a comment, and you can probably have a good discussion. But maybe maybe they'll just accept that. But they will be relieved that you've not put them on the spot and you've not said something inappropriate. They will be glad to hear you versus someone that has said something they should not have said. Good will come out of this, I promise. You know, it's hard to understand why this happened. See the difference in the two? It's God's will. You know, one comfort I find is God's promise never to abandon us. He will always stay with us. In other words, just reframe and rephrase the words and the statement that you're going to make. But just remember this, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten your first name again.
Cheryl.
Cheryl.
Yes, sir.
Okay. The simplest, the greatest comments we can make are the simplest ones. I love you. I'm praying for you. I am so sorry. Can I give you a hug? Or can I sit here and listen if you want to talk? Just say the simplest things. We can all do that. We can all do that. Well, we've gone through a lot of stuff. Let's take about 5 minutes, and then we're going to come back and finish up, and we'll get you out of here before 12 noon. Thank you so much.